Sam will get going with our presentation.
So, hi everyone, if I haven't met you yet, I'm Samantha McCrane. I'm the technical coordinator at SBTN. So the first thing we wanted to do was just remind you all of the big picture of what we're working on this year. If you haven't seen this slide before, I'll just talk through it really quickly. So the different color codes correspond to the different pieces of work that we're doing. The pieces in dark blue are a part of what we call our translation work stream. This is our work stream that's focusing on, in particular, questions related to step 3 in the initial guidance. So it's how to downscale targets, how to set thresholds, how to convert responses that companies would be taking in order to meet their targets into pressures and states. So that's what's going on in the dark blue up at the top. The light blue are all the activities specifically with corporates. So with the corporate engagement program, as well as the work that the Water Hub is doing independently with companies. The pieces in yellow are either internal or external facing products. So these are things that are coming out and will be circulated to the corporate engagement program, as well as more broadly with the public. The pieces in green are external events. The piece in light gray is related to the Earth Commission, which you may or may not have heard of before. The pieces in purple are specific outputs that are coming out from our issues or method hubs. And then the pieces in pink at the bottom are with our tools workstream, which some of you have interacted with before. And so on the very left side, that's all of the pieces that have already been done that are sort of on that orange shaded side. So we've already kicked off the Water Hub methods. We've internally had an ideation session on step 3. We had a bit of a tool scoping workshop, or a user needs workshop rather, with the corporate engagement program. Our methods hubs have had a couple different workshops. And so that's where we are today. And in the white zone is sort of where our teams are focused right now in terms of our work that we're putting out. And then on the right-hand side of the screen is sort of what we call the zone of uncertainty. That's where we have a lot more question marks about what's happening. And when exactly things are going to be coming out. We're fairly confident that by the end of the year, we're going to have a draft method for water, for land, and our biodiversity hub will have initial guidance on how to use the STAR metric being developed by IUCN to set targets for species. We're fairly confident we'll have an initial draft of what tools will look like to support SBTs. But what we are less sure about is how those are going to be timed in relation to, for instance, the IUCN World Conservation Congress, the CBD COP, the UNFCCC COP, and as well how they're going to play on the initial report being released by the Earth Commission in the tail end of this year. And then the other piece in that zone is the an updated version of the guidance. So this is just an overview of what's going on within SBTN this year, what sort of to expect on the tail end of this year. And just to say, timing is still to be determined, but we're fairly confident we'll have all of those things by the end of this year. So Sarah, if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. So I'll just go over really quickly the tools workstream, which again, many of you have had interactions with. I recognize some of the names and faces I saw this morning from that workshop a couple weeks ago. So just as a refresh, the ultimate goal of the workstream is to produce a comprehensive tool or toolkit that can enable all types of companies to operationalize all steps of the SBT process. Because currently we just have a list of tools which together don't necessarily get you to a target itself or to being able to monitor and report on and verify progress against those targets. So what we ultimately want to come up with is a toolkit that can do everything from assess to actually setting those targets and then to the MRV of those targets. So by the end of June, we want to have at least an initial idea of what are the best tools available that companies can use to do that. There might be some nuances in terms of what tools are appropriate for different types of companies, but by the end of June, we're aiming to have that, and that will be based on the user needs assessment work which you all participated in, as well as a broader tool scoping review, which is going on right now. And so our sort of minimum viable product that we're aiming for by the end of June is just criteria for the tools that we would recommend to companies, and how they can be used. Because that was one of the key pieces of feedback that we got in the workshop, is that the tools that we've currently identified, it's not as clear as it could be about how companies can use them. And so, yeah, we'll be producing a bit more thorough guidance on how to use the tools already in existence and reviewed by SBTN. So as a summary of the outcomes of the first workshop, we aligned on a vision and the key user needs requirements for a tool specification, and identified some questions that require further investigation. And so in order to flesh out those questions, the user needs group will start scheduling focus groups starting this month and going into April. And then what we also have going on right now, as I referred to before, is we have this tool scoping work that's being led somewhat independently of the user needs work. And they have developed this initial tools register, which includes currently over 100 different potential tools that can be used. And we're reviewing those with the technical experts throughout the network, but also trying to review them with considerations from the user needs work. And Sarah, if you could go to the next slide, please. And so some of you may have seen this slide before. These are some of the opportunities related to the tools work. So the first one, or the first row, we've already done. We already had our user needs workshop. The second one, which is coming up, is the focus groups and potential interviews. Interviews won't be happening with everyone, but focus groups will be more inclusive. So there'll be small sessions to work on some of the key issues that came out during the last workshop and questions that have come up amongst our teams. And then in June, with this group, with the corporate engagement program, at least, we will be going over the draft specification that our team has come up with in order to verify that it sounds like what you've asked for, and to get further feedback on how we can improve it. And Sarah, if you could go to the next. Thank you. So hopefully you all know by now, SBTN is organized into water, land, oceans, and biodiversity hub. And then we work with SBTI as our sort of climate hub. Within our water hub, they have just begun to test their draft methods with 3 companies. So they're working really closely with 3 companies to run through all 5 steps laid out in the initial guidance, but tailoring that guidance specifically to water. They're focusing on both water quantity as well as water quality, and they're aiming to wrap those pilots up by the end of 2021. So we'll be able to share some learnings from that as we go along, but there is also a self-guided pilot opportunity available to members of the corporate engagement program. And the key sort of touch point with the Water Hub for that are these office hours. The Water Hub leads will be holding, I believe, every month to answer questions. So we can keep going back. We can also pause here if there are any questions we want to address. Rachel?
Yeah, nothing from the chat, but if someone wants to raise their hand, they're welcome to ask a question.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm not sure how to raise my hand on this one. It's Harry here from the commissioners. I'm just wondering whether you're able to, and sorry, I might have missed this. Are you sharing the slides, or are you able to share the timetable one at the front that you had with the zone of uncertainty at the end? That would be really helpful.
So we will share the slides at the end.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you.
Yep.
And Sam, there was a question from Nadine at WBCSD about a list of FAQs. Can you talk about the availability of the FAQ?
Sure. So our communications team has a preference for integrating the FAQs into the website. So we don't necessarily have a standalone list of FAQs. We do have those available as an internal partner resource. So I'd have to check with my team how, if at all, we can share those with this group. But yeah, currently we're just working to integrate the answers to those FAQs into the actual website itself, rather than having a standalone FAQ document. Thanks, Chris.
Actually, I can just come in. It's Nadine McCormick from WPCSD. Just
Hi.
to build on that, so that's great to hear. And actually, I think that type of resource would be really helpful. I'm even just seeing some of the questions there earlier on, like Joshua had a really interesting question. It's a one that I've heard as well before as well. So it's almost like an FAQ, if it could keep growing as well, like, you know, of questions that come out of the calls like this one as well. That would be a really amazing resource, which to help us go back to be champions in our respective networks. So yeah, just if that would be possible to share that web link at one point, that would be amazing. Thanks.
Yeah, so just to clarify, we do have that document. We just have been steered by our communications team to keep it integrated into the website rather than having it be a standalone. But we can bring back the feedback that we're hearing from you right now that it could be helpful to have a standalone document available to partners. So yeah, it's really good feedback.
Okay, but maybe not standalone if there was a web page and just that's where we knew to go. If we've got one of those questions, but it's more this idea of like, as questions emerge from these calls, then like the answers, if they could be integrated in that web page and eventually just becomes that a resource in itself, right? So yeah, wherever it sits, it doesn't matter. But yeah, I would just say like Joshua, I don't know, had a really good question, and just in terms of like, you know, the separate guidance or targets for each of the, you know, with the water and biodiversity, etc. And a really good response to the chat box. I just don't want to lose that. I think that, you know, that's the type of information that's really helpful for us to, you know, be the first shield of questions that come from some of the partners in our networks.
Mm-hmm. That is definitely one of our FAQs as well.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, this actually is Josh here as well. So it sounds like the response is that, yes, you would set multiple independent targets based on the ones that are material to your company. So then a follow-up question I would have on that is like, at my company, for example, we have already developed water targets based on quantity and quality and water stress. So those are like kind of done in our view. Whereas for biodiversity, we're trying to actively set targets. So like, how would that work if we kind of feel like we are developed in one of the SBTN focus areas, but we're hoping to develop in a new one?
So by the way, Chris Weber is our technical director. I should have introduced him. He's also on the call. So Chris, if you want to respond to that.
I can try. Yeah, I'll be upfront that I don't think we have the full answer yet, because it's both tied to kind of technical questions as well as to communications questions. Like I think on the technical side, what we would say is yes, proceed using like the science-based biodiversity targets methods, and also, you know, potentially like at least reconsider like whether your water targets are aligned with the SBT for water methods. But like we haven't fully resolved the question of sort of like in your particular situation, how would you then communicate this? Would you say we have, you know, our company has science-based targets for biodiversity or science-based targets for nature, like, and like those are in active discussion right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Chris, just building on that, our Water Hub is working with some companies that already have relatively advanced water targets or relatively advanced water work. And the first thing that they're doing is a gap assessment. So I think, Joshua, that's the kind of thing that would happen for a company like yours, as you undertake a sort of gap assessment to understand how what you're doing might differ from what SBTN guidance would look like, not having to start from scratch.
Okay, yeah, and I feel like if there was some sort of like validation tool or validation, I don't know if that would be independent, that could be helpful.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Validation is another hot topic in the network, but yeah, we're working on that. Are there any other questions? I know I saw somebody else come off or come on camera, but I don't know if we answered any questions.
Hi, Samantha. It's Kimberly Chan here. I've just got a more general question about the expectation of SBTN members to do the step 1, so the value chain mapping this year. Can you just maybe elaborate a little bit more what is expected? Is it to map the whole of our direct operations and then wherever we can find data on the other parts to do that as well? Or can we limit it to like a business line or a product? Or yeah, it's just a bit ambiguous for us where to focus and how to scope. Thanks.
Understandably so. this is something that we've been refining our guidance on since producing it, to be honest. So in the initial guidance, we would typically say you want to focus where it looks like you have the most material impacts, right? So if you're a company that has upstream impacts, you probably would focus upstream rather than direct operations. But given that the guidance isn't complete, methods aren't complete, I think it's fine to start where you can. So you can focus on just a specific product line. But yeah, I'll let Chris build on that.
So it's important to, kind of first recognize that one of the challenges we've had in writing the guidance and just giving guidance as a whole is that what we expect the methods to be developed, that will be developed for each issue, to be fairly nuanced and different from one another. And B, we're trying to provide guidance to companies as different as like mining companies who might have 5 sites that are all where they have full primary data, and then value chain companies who have primary data only for their direct operations and limited traceability down to the commodity level. So like trying to come up with guidance for both of those groups of companies across all of these different issues is challenging, and that's why there's some ambiguity in a lot of these key points. I think what we would say is that basically different parts of step 1 are going to be done at different levels, and then it's going to be different depending on where you sit in the value chain. So clearly step 1A is done at the company level. You should be doing that high level materiality assessment across all of the issues and across all of the phases of the value chain. The step 1B, where you kind of dig in a little bit further and try and gather, estimate your impacts, that's where there's a lot of nuance depending on what type of company you are. I think that there are tools available to kind of get an overarching, impact assessment, but not necessarily have that be spatially resolved and requiring a lot of primary data. So we would hope that you could kind of do an overarching estimate, but then the level to which you would dig down and try and get that primary data and the kind of spatially explicit value chain stuff, that's going to be a little bit different depending on different types of companies. And we would hope that you would try and get as much primary data for the most material inputs as possible. But what that, whether that there's a firm requirement of you must cover X% of your estimated impact, we haven't given guidance on that yet, and I think it's a bit of a judgment call. Hopefully that was clear.
All right, should we keep moving? The next thing we're going to go over is step 1, so I'm sure there will be more step 1 questions. So I'll just read this over for everyone. So in the initial guidance, we state that step 1 is about helping companies to gather or supplement existing data to estimate value chain-wide impacts and dependencies on nature. And the key output that we expect for this step is a list of potential issue areas and locations for target setting. And of course, those locations are gathered through step 1B versus the issue areas through step 1A, and then refined in step 1B and C. We are currently developing, so the top part of this slide is what we've already said in the guidance, and then the bottom part of this slide is what we're working on right now. So this is also why we're trying to the best of our abilities to answer all of your questions, but this is an ongoing area of work. So we are currently developing a concise overview of the sort of sub-steps, which is not a great word, but anyway, which are 1A, 1B, 1C, to detail the purpose of each step, give greater clarity on the inputs needed from companies to carry out those steps, and then the outputs they can expect in terms of what form those take, what level of granularity to expect in terms of the outputs. And then we're also working on these key questions and trying to develop further prescriptive guidance on things like what criteria and thresholds can be used to assess materiality in step 1A, so that you don't, for instance, need to depend on a certain type of tool, so that you have an understanding of what's the criteria I need to use to evaluate materiality. What are the thresholds that push something to be material or immaterial? we're trying to get greater clarity in terms of guidance on what is the minimum data needed to carry out step 1B, as well as criteria and principles for excluding issue areas from assessment and target setting. And so you might hear in what I'm just saying right now, this is addressing some of the questions that we've heard from all of you previously, and also this seems to correspond to some of the questions I'm already hearing today. So just to say, the things that you've told us thus far are feeding directly into the work that we're doing right now and the guidance that we're trying to develop. So let's go to the next slide. So in step 2 of the guidance, we introduce this as saying that it is about interpreting the outputs of step 1 so that companies can prioritize locations for taking action. And as an output from step 2, companies should have a list of sites associated with certain inputs and products, or however you're organizing your different business activities. And those are the different sites or inputs and products that you need to start gathering baseline data for step 3. And so just as in the slide before, for step 2, we're currently developing that concise overview of the different sub-steps, the purpose of each step, the inputs needed, and the outputs that companies can expect. And then we're also developing further guidance on what constitutes things like minimum target coverage. So this is a sort of more rigorous way for companies to define what needs to be in targets set in step 3, what can be defined as critical impact of a company. That's particularly something that the Water Hub is working on. And then providing clearer guidance on how to prioritize between areas using which data sets, how to weight factors against one another. Because right now in the guidance, it's more sort of descriptive rather than prescriptive on how to prioritize. And we want to make that a lot more clear and easy for companies. So there's fewer question marks. And okay, so on this slide are some of the questions that our corporate engagement team have gathered for us to go over today. Jess, do you want to focus on any of them, or do you want me to just go through these and try to answer as we go?
Go in order.
All right. So I'll go over these now, but I realize what I just said on the other 2 slides might have raised more questions for you all. So I'll go over these and then let's pause and take live questions. So some questions that we keep getting is, when is that sectoral materiality matrix going to be updated? This is something we are waiting on the outputs from our tools work stream to decide how to develop it out. So it won't be updated and shared publicly probably until June, which I understand might be a bit longer than what people are looking for, but hopefully some of the things that we put out in our sort of step 1 and 2 memo, which Chris and I will be sharing outputs from with you all in about a month. Hopefully some of the pieces from that will help to answer some of the questions that the sectoral materiality matrix addresses. So it won't necessarily be updated until June, but again, hopefully we'll get you some answers in a month or so. Where should we use subsector scale versus activity scale? I look at these things kind of interchangeably. An activity, you could think like dairy production versus just production as a subsector activity. Subsector scale could be production versus activity could be like dairy production. Are there guidelines on how to get information on materiality if there is no data in Encore? Not right now, and that's what we're working on. Should companies identify priorities relative to their revenues for different activities having different impacts? Great question. That is something that we're also trying to answer right now. What is the role of things like revenue or value added, spend, different things like that, and helping companies to prioritize where to assess in step 1. How should dependencies be considered? Dependencies should be considered separately from impacts. Given the amount of questions that we have gotten from people on dependencies, we're actively considering, how to maybe shift our guidance on this, because dependencies are admittedly a bit more relevant from a financial perspective of materiality than a societal perspective of materiality, which is the one that we take in the guidance and take as a network, because dependencies are more likely to result in, like financial consequences for companies. For instance, if there is a hazard and the environment that you're in is not able to provide like hazard buffering services, that's going to result in financial consequences for the company rather than potentially societal consequences, although they can be linked. Anyways, dependencies should probably be considered separately from impacts, but again, we're trying to refine our guidance on how to bring the two together. I'm going to pause there. Chris, do you want to add anything to any of those questions?
I'll just note that we had a question in the chat box about whether we were going to add dependencies to the materiality matrix, and as as Sam said, we're still figuring out kind of how it fits into the overall architecture. But it's important to note that the matrix is built on the underlying Encore tool, and the underlying Encore tool does in fact have both impacts and dependencies. So regardless of whether you're doing it for SBTN or for another purpose, you can, assess your dependencies using that underlying tool.
Thanks, Chris. And all right, so the second half of this slide is on the data collection guide, which admittedly that is the newest thing that we have put out. So I'm not surprised that we have gotten a lot of questions on it. I just want to say it's not done. When we released it, it was a draft for the corporate engagement program, hoping to answer some of the questions that we had gotten thus far on the decision tree, how to collect data, etc. But clearly we still have a bit of work to do. I just want to say using the data collection guide is not mandatory. It is not mandatory to share your data with SBTN. It is just meant to be a resource to help companies get organized and to think through how to collect this information as you go through the steps, given that, again, there are no tools that exist to walk you through the whole thing. It was supposed to be a bit of a supplement for that. I'm just checking if there are any questions that we need to go over in detail. I'm going to leave it at that. Matteo, I just saw you come on video. Is there something you want to ask specifically?
Stephanie speaking.
Hi, Stephanie.
From Firmenich. I have a question with regard to the different tools and methodologies you are also assessing through the whole work you are doing within SBTN. And I understood that you were in touch with many of them for sure, but one in particular, which is the Union for Ethical Biotrade. And I was wondering if you or when you would be able to provide us with some feedback on how you're collaborating with such initiatives to understand how we can continue to leverage such partnership in order to meet our SBTN commitment. Because as you mentioned earlier, the idea is to build on existing initiatives and metrics that are ongoing or under construction. So how can we get some updates on where you stand in the discussion? To what extent it's a positive discussion, or it's very much under questioning of the relevancy. So if you could give us some updates on that, or maybe it's another session.
Yeah, so I can speak to that really quickly. Our partnership with UEBT is pretty new. So we are still trying to figure out how best to work together. They have at least initially joined our biodiversity hub. So they're participating in conversations about what biodiversity targets will look like. And then they've also joined our tools work stream. So they're particularly because they do have some tools that might be of relevance for SBTs. They're going to be participating in those conversations, but I unfortunately don't have that much more to share with you right now, just because it is such a new partnership. Chris, do you want to add anything on that?
Not at this time. I'm in the same boat as you.
Thanks a lot.
Are there any other questions? I can see some things happening in the chat box, but I don't know, Rachel, if you want to call anything out, or if anybody wants to raise a hand.
Everything's been answered in the chat. Anyone else have a question they want to ask live?
Hi, sorry, I might have missed a previous explanation on this. You just mentioned some biodiversity hubs, and is that a separate working group or is that within SBTN? Sorry, I didn't quite understood how is that.
So no worries. We try to avoid talking about it because it is sort of internal politics that we don't want. We don't want to create confusion. But when talking about the way that different partners, non-corporate partners interact with SBTN, they typically will sort of attach to or work directly with a sort of methods hub or issue hub, as we call them. And so we have 4 different methods hubs that sit directly under SBTN. So that's the biodiversity hub, the freshwater hub, the land hub, and the oceans hub. And then we work directly with SBTI as sort of our climate hub. And so those are the different sort of hubs that are developing the different methods that feed into SBTs for nature. If that makes sense. But yeah, we try to avoid talking about it to not create too much confusion.
No, that's fine.
But that's how like the NGO partners that we work with will engage with SBTN is by engaging directly in those hubs and participating in the conversations to shape up the
So
method.
any developments within those hubs are shared with us. Is that right?
Yes. So they would, Chris and I sit across all of those hubs. Because we're the sort of cross-cutting technical team. So we sit across all of those hubs and we also help to steer those hubs. But so any developments that are happening at hub level will be fed through us and then into the corporate engagement work.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. And if there are opportunities to engage directly with the hubs, like the water hub pilots opportunity right now, we would share that with you as well.
Sam, we have a question. So is it expected the disclosure of assessments carried out to assign the sectoral scores in the materiality table for upstream, direct, and downstream impacts?
So we don't expect any disclosure until step 3 of the guidance, because I'm assuming that question's in reference to step 1. So no, there is no expectation on disclosure in step 1 about sectoral assessments. Chris, do you want to build on
that? Yeah, we've gotten this question, varieties on this question from several places, and I think it's fair to say that we will expect some level of disclosure of aggregated impacts when the target is being set and validated. So this is, if you're familiar with kind of how this works in climate, like as part of the validation step when you're setting your science-based target for climate, there's a step to disclose your full greenhouse gas inventory, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. So we would be expecting something like that will be similar for each of the different methods. Unfortunately, we don't have the kind of same standards to fall back on like the greenhouse gas protocol. But where there are existing reporting standards, we will rely on them, and where there aren't, we'll try to kind of have as streamlined of guidance as possible in terms of how you would kind of report, the impacts and like the target coverage of those total impacts, if that makes sense.
Exactly. And what Chris is speaking to is sort of the validation process or the validation scheme that would be associated with SBTN and SBTs, which we are actively developing. We don't have a firm procedure for that yet.
We're all setting questions in the chat, so you can continue with the questions on the data guide on the screen.
Okay. Oh, Sarah, will you go back? So I'll just go over these really quickly. For question 6 for step 5, again, it's not mandatory to evaluate anything at the moment. So that's the answer to step or to question 6. For 7, for number of inputs. So what we're trying to do in the data collection guide is to give a consistent way of tracking things across different parts of the value chain, right? So upstream, you could think about that as inputs or suppliers, direct operations, and then downstream products or markets. We don't have a firm or an easy way to compare that right now, open to suggestions. But I would just say try to be as consistent as possible in the units that you're using. Again, this was supposed to be a tool to help companies. And if it's not super clear, we appreciate feedback on how to make it better. And then should upstream and downstream activities be treated as separate activities? Yes. And are they separated activities or linked with direct operations? They should be treated as separate. And again, Chris, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Nope.
All right. I don't know if there are any further questions on that.
Does anyone else have a question they want to ask live about the collection guide? Nope, Sam, no questions in the chat and no one's raised their hand. You're good to go.
All right. And yeah, I would just say, because this is so new and because we are getting a lot of questions on it, I'm happy to have a bilateral conversation with folks afterwards that have specific questions on this to work on it more thoroughly.
Actually, Sam, one sec. Could you just repeat the answer that you said to question 7 one more time?
Okay. So for number of inputs or suppliers, or for operations or products, markets, that would be the answer for 7. And it's just the number of those, right? So you're tracking how many things are using that activity, which are associated with different dependencies and impacts, which again, may not be the perfect way to do this, but that's what we have in there right now. But it's just the number of inputs, products, operations, or markets where that activity is associated with. And then how can it be compared in terms of the magnitude of numbers associated with those different activities. And then should it be in monetary value or volume or other unit? If you're using number of inputs, it would just be a number. But if you would like to provide monetary values or volumes or other units that are associated with the different activities or inputs, suppliers, etc., feel free to do so. Again, this is something that we have further work to do. So happy to take feedback on ways that would make more sense to you to track this.
We do have another question that popped up. So how to move from business activities, location-based template 7 to company refined sector level template 8 for comparison of the later with SBT sectoral level template 3. I don't know if you can answer that live. We might have to address that in the chat. Yeah,
because I'd have to go back and look at the actual collection guide in order to answer it. Sorry.
You can continue on, Sam. We're good.
All right. Sarah, could you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so step 3, this is something that we just started really digging into over the last month or so. In the guidance, we say that this step is about collecting baseline data for prioritized targets and locations. Using the data from this and previous steps, companies can set targets aligned with Earth's limits and societal goals, and then targets should be disclosed publicly to ensure accountability and create a culture of transparency. So again, this is the first step where we really talk about public disclosure. The first 2 steps, we do not mention that intentionally because we don't have specific guidance on that yet. So right now we're working on things like defining the indicators, the appropriate scales and units of measurement, as well as tools and resources available associated with baseline determination. So that will be available later this year. As well, we're also working to determine how to account for historical contributions to pressures and impacts, how to balance between different thresholds and goals. For instance, we often get the question of what do you do when thresholds and goals might differ from the global to local level or regional level? How do you differ between, biophysical thresholds like Earth's limits versus societal goals? So we're still working on developing more prescriptive guidance on how to balance between those things. And we will not have more information for this group on this step until June. We can go to the next slide. Right, so this first question is a bit in line with the one that we had on the first slide, but I'll go over that here as well. I'll just read through the question in full first. So how can dependencies be translated into a target? How can ART be applied for SBTs related to a dependency? And then how can dependencies be compared and prioritized among impacts? So you can use dependencies for a number of different things. You can use dependencies for spatial prioritization in terms of places to avoid and reduce impacts. For instance, you might not want to be contaminating the water source that you depend on as an input to your products. So where you have a dependency and impacts in the same place, that might determine the amount of ambition that you have in that place, as well as what types of actions you would take. Dependencies might also be useful for informing ambition levels for restore and regenerate targets. For instance, if you have a strong dependency, which is at risk in a given location, you might want to begin exploring restorative or regenerative options to improve the status of the ecosystem or of the natural capital stock that you're reliant on. And then dependencies can also help you identify locations where you might want to take collective action. Just because of the nature of dependencies, they're often shared between different actors. So again, it might be helpful for you in terms of determining what kinds of action to take. And so hopefully that also just answered the different types of AR3T. So they could be helpful for avoid targets as well as reduce. Could also be helpful for restore and regenerate, and then transform in terms of collective action. And then how can they be compared and prioritized among impacts? I somewhat answered that earlier today. We're currently treating them separately, but I think when there are places where you have an impact and a dependency, it may be relevant for the company to try to reduce that impact in order to help themselves with a dependency. How do we see certification? So this is a great question. This is something we're still working on, and the different hubs that we work with are, they have slightly different opinions on this depending on the certification scheme. So what I'm going to say right now doesn't apply to all certification. It will apply to some, but so certification schemes in some cases may be used to verify whether targets need to be set if a company already has certification in place. So it may be a way for a company to exclude evaluating a product in further detail, or avoid having to do a further assessment in a certain location that might have certification in place. But again, it depends on the certification, and we're still working with our hubs to determine which certifications would qualify for this. And then that final question on preferred or sustainable materials. This is actually a question we have not gotten yet, or at least I have not heard this yet. So I don't have a great answer for you, but it does sound like this is the sort of thing that would factor into avoid and reduce targets. So if you're avoiding using a certain type of material or reducing your use of a certain type of material, you might substitute it for preferred or sustainable materials. But my question when you're substituting is, what are the effects of moving towards that new material? Are we going to create new negative impacts? So I think there's a bit more research that we would need to do before we'd be confident in suggesting certain materials as being preferred or sustainable, because of course that preference or sustainability depends on the amount of uptake and where they're being used, etc. So it's something to watch for, and not to just, we wouldn't sort of absolutely recommend it. It would be a bit situational. So hopefully that is clear, and I don't know if anybody wants to add questions on steps 3 to 5 while Chris and I are on the line.
Yeah, so either you or Chris could answer this regards to step 3. So how different is the step 3 baseline to be from the step 1 assessment?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and again, it gets back to one of the earlier questions about the sort of the level of detail in terms of primary and spatial data kind of requirements, and the kind of difficulty of describing this in a way that will make sense for all types of companies and all types of issues. I think the general answer is that the step 3, when you're setting a baseline in step 3, that's the value that you're going to have to try to change with the target. So like that baseline has to kind of be at enough resolution that you can kind of measure changes in it as you progress towards the target. That level of resolution is likely to be higher than the level of resolution, both spatially and kind of primary versus secondary data, that's needed to just assess materiality in step 1. So the main answer is basically that, like, in step 1, you're trying to get enough detail and resolution to be able to kind of assess materiality, both spatial and issue materiality, and that's probably going to be a lot of secondary data still, and kind of modeled data. Whereas in step 3, once you've kind of determined which issues and where is going to be within your target boundary, probably more primary data is going to be needed to set that baseline, because you need to kind of be measuring progress against that baseline. Hopefully that's clear.
Does anyone else have a question they want to ask live about steps 3 to 5?
Hi. Yes. So, for instance, the platform ARIS, that's a modeling tool. Would that be expected to be used in step 1 and not in step 3 to inform decision making? Is that the sort of interpretation? So it allows you to consider various options in terms of decision making, but also provides the outcome for it. So it's a bit difficult. Sometimes some tools are there to help you inform decision making, but should we apply them in step 1 then? So I'm a bit confused about that.
Yeah, again, this is a great question, and one that we're trying to resolve a bit more through the tools work stream, where we're going to have this user needs assessment. And we're trying, when we're doing this, we're making this big review of tools that exist, and try to understand what the inputs and outputs of each one of these tools are, and kind of what the resolution is. And that will help inform us as to whether it's a tool that's primarily going to be used for step 1 as like a kind of a screening tool to try and understand your exposure, versus a tool for kind of tracking progress over time in steps 3 through 5. And different tools are designed differently, and some of them are going to be much more relevant for doing the materiality step, and some of them may be more advanced enough to actually measure your baseline and track progress over time. So we will be giving more guidance on this as the tools work stream moves forward.
Thank you.
Bouke here, Corbion. I was wondering, it has to do with the baseline assessment, maybe as much with step 1 as it does with step 3, but what I found really useful was to look at your indicator crosswalk from the technical annex, but it's obviously not fully finished yet. And I was also in the Align program workshop yesterday from the EU, and I was just wondering what the priority was regarding this indicator crosswalk, and how it, if you already worked, or you were at least mentioned in their workshop, but in to what extent you already work together.
Chris, do you want to lead on that?
Sure. Yes. So two different questions there. Both with Align, yes, we are going to try to fully align with the Align project. We are going to have several points of intersection. Most of the Align partners are SBTN partners and or consultants that are part of the corporate engagement program, and we'll sit on their advisory committee. They sit on lots of our groups, and absolutely, we're going to try to align as much as possible. The goal and scope are slightly different because, as I understand it, at least the Align project is more tilted towards natural capital accounting, which may or may not be relevant to science-based targets, just because if you're using like a monetary basis for natural capital accounting, it's a bit harder to connect that to science than it is using kind of like biophysical measures. So we're going to be in talks with them about that. But how that regards the indicator crosswalk work, absolutely updating that is one of our key priorities, and we are in the midst of making a database that is considerably more detailed than that. That adds a lot more kind of the connections between various indicators, corporate reporting standards, and the kind of societal measurement frameworks like the SDGs and the CBD post-2020 proposed monitoring framework, which unfortunately is not final, so that's holding us up a little bit. But we will be updating that and providing much further guidance. Basically, that indicator crosswalk and that idea of sort of which indicators are easiest to measure and best aligned is guiding all of the technical development that we're doing right now. So we're trying to figure out, kind of get this balance of when we have a specific issue, how can we pick the right indicator that is some combination of easiest to measure and most aligned with like the societal goals and the like planetary boundaries that we're interested in. And we will absolutely have an updated version of that very soon, probably mid-year this year, that will have considerably more detail than the current one.
Yeah, and Chris, just building on that, it's good that Bauke asked that after Joanna, because that's one of the things that we're using to evaluate tools as well, is we're seeing which indicators the tools are using. And so that way we can connect directly our tools assessment work as well as our translation work, so that we're making sure that we're recommending tools that are using they're using indicators rather that are in line with our indicator framework, and they're in line with the things that we want companies to be measuring and using to set targets. So it's good that you two just asked those questions in sequence.
Thanks, very clear.
Anyone else have a question they want to ask?
Yeah, if I may, I don't want to have all the deck, but so in terms of biodiversity metrics or indicators, I just wonder if there's anything on the horizon. I know there are several being developed and even assessed. I wonder if in that indicator crosswalk, you mentioned species extinction per year, if I remember correctly. But I wonder if there will be any developments soon in terms of metrics for species or species equivalent, that sort of thing.
I'll let Chris.
Do you want to take that, Sam, or do you want me to?
I'll let you go.
Yeah, so good question. So species related indicators are one of the key biodiversity developments that the Biodiversity Hub is working on. There's two kind of subtypes. There's species extinction risk and species abundance, and both are widely recognized and part of the CBD monitoring framework. There are modeling approaches available for both. One of them is in active development called the STAR metric, which I always forget what it stands for. It's Species Threat Abatement and Restoration, I think. And that is IUCN is leading that work, and we will specifically be kind of trialing out that method as it's published like imminently, like literally I think this week. And then it will be put into several tools, including Encore and the IBAT tool that probably several of you are familiar with. So that will be one key method. On the species abundance side, there's several different tools that work with species abundance related indicators, like the Global Biodiversity Score from CDC and several others. We will eventually be providing guidance on species abundance related indicators and targets as well.
So just seeing we're at 2 minutes left. I know we only have one piece of AOB. Rachel, if you want to go to the last, or sorry, Sarah, rather. Jess, do you want to lead this?
Yeah, so our next get together with you guys will be on April 8th, where we're going to do a feedback session on steps 1 and 2, and we'll be sending some read aheads for you to digest with your teams before coming into that meeting. And so just be on the lookout for that invitation. At our next learning session, we're going to try to do regularly scheduled learning sessions also. I think it's very valuable for us also to understand where there's lack of clarity. So we'll probably do one in May. I've been speaking with some of you about some of the cool stuff you're doing on step 1. And so we do want to provide an opportunity at that next learning session for you, if you want to share what you're doing, kind of a show and tell. I think it would be interesting for all the other companies to see how you're addressing stuff. So that opportunity is open for everyone. I've talked to a few of you individually. So just have that on your radar also. Any other questions, Rachel, coming in before we depart?
No other questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much for participating, everyone. This has been awesome, and look forward to seeing you again soon.